The thunder rolled across the vast Texas sky as Emma Ainsworth clutched her satchel tighter, the rain pelting her face with such ferocity she could barely see the path ahead. It was 1878, and Fort Worth was supposed to be her salvation, not this treacherous mountain pass that separated her from the promise of a new beginning. The stagecoach had broken down 5 miles back, and the driver had given her directions to follow the trail into town. "Just stay on the path, miss," he'd said. "You'll be there before nightfall." But nightfall had come early with the storm, and now Emma found herself inching along a narrow ledge that seemed to be crumbling beneath her feet with each step. Emma's gloved fingers scraped against the slick rock wall to her right as she edged forward. 22 years old and alone in the world, she had nothing to lose by pressing on and everything to gain if she reached Fort Worth by morning. The teaching position wouldn't wait for her if she didn't appear promptly for the interview. After her parents' deaths from influenza last winter, this opportunity was her only chance to build a life of her own. "Just a little farther," she whispered to herself, her voice stolen by the howling wind. The path ahead disappeared into darkness, illuminated only by occasional flashes of lightning that revealed the dizzying drop to her left. She took another careful step, then felt it the sickening shift of earth beneath her boot, the sudden absence of solid ground. Emma's scream tore from her throat as her body lurched sideways, the world tilting around her. Her satchel went flying as she clawed desperately at the edge, fingernails breaking against stone, rain-slicked hands finding no purchase. A shadow moved above her large, imposing, materializing from nowhere like a specter in the storm. A man, his face obscured by the wide brim of a cowboy hat, dropped to his stomach at the edge of the cliff, thrusting his arm downward toward her flailing form. "Grab my wrist and do not look down." His deep voice commanded through the chaos of the storm. Emma's fingers found his forearm, slippery with rain. She clutched at the wet leather of his sleeve, feeling the solid strength beneath. His large hand wrapped around her wrist in return, the grip firm and unyielding. "I've got you," he said, his voice steady despite the strain evident in his face when lightning briefly illuminated his features. "Now give me your other hand." Emma swung her free arm upward, terror giving her strength she didn't know she possessed. Their hands connected, and with a powerful heave, he began pulling her up over the edge. Her body scraped against the rocky cliff face, but she barely felt the pain, focused only on the security of his grip and the promise of solid ground. With one final effort, he dragged her over the precipice. They collapsed together on the muddy trail, both gasping for breath. Emma found herself pulled against a broad chest, the man's arms instinctively wrapping around her as they rolled away from the edge. When they finally stilled, Emma looked up into the face of her rescuer. Another flash of lightning revealed a strong jaw covered with stubble, intense eyes studying her with concern, and rain dripping from the brim of his hat onto her cheeks. "Are you hurt, miss?" he asked, his voice gentler now that the immediate danger had passed. Emma took quick stock of herself, scraped palms, torn dress, a throbbing in her ankle, but she was alive. "I don't think so," she managed. "You saved my life." He helped her to a sitting position, keeping a steadying hand on her shoulder. "What in heaven's name are you doing out in this storm on this trail of all places?" "I'm trying to reach Fort Worth," Emma explained, pushing wet strands of hair from her face. "The stagecoach broke down and I have to be there by morning." The man shook his head, water cascading from his hat. "No appointments worth risking your life over. This trail's dangerous even in clear weather." He glanced down the path. "Your belongings," Emma gasped. "My satchel, it fell when I slipped." "It's gone now," he said grimly, "but you're not, and that's what matters." He stood and offered her his hand. "I'm Hank Forrester. I've got a cabin about half a mile from here. We need to get you somewhere dry before this storm gets worse." Emma hesitated for just a moment before accepting his hand. "Emma Ainsworth," she replied, wincing as she put weight on her ankle. "I think I may have twisted my ankle in the fall." Without warning, Henry bent and swept her into his arms. "Then we'd best not waste time," he said, his voice matter-of-fact though Emma could feel the rapid beat of his heart against her side. "Hold on tight, Miss Ainsworth. The path gets narrower ahead." Emma wrapped her arms around his neck, too exhausted and grateful to protest being carried by a stranger. As Henry began walking carefully along the trail, she caught the scents of leather, horse, and something distinctly masculine beneath the rain. For the first time since the stagecoach had left her, Emma felt a sense of security wash over her. "Thank you, Mr. Forrester," she murmured against his shoulder. "Most folks just call me Hank," he replied, his eyes fixed on the treacherous path ahead. "And there's no need for thanks." "Couldn't very well leave you hanging off a cliff now, could I?" Emma managed a small laugh despite everything. "I suppose not. Still, I'm grateful." She paused. "Do you live in these mountains?" "Got a small ranch on the other side. Was heading into Fort Worth for supplies when I spotted movement on the trail." He adjusted his grip, his arms seemingly untired by her weight. "Lucky timing, I'd say." "Providence," Emma whispered. Henry made no comment, but his arms tightened almost imperceptibly around her as they continued through the driving rain toward safety. The cabin materialized out of the darkness like a mirage, a solid, sturdy structure of logs and stone that seemed to grow from the mountainside itself. By the time they reached the covered porch, Emma was shivering uncontrollably, her dress soaked through, her teeth chattering. "Let me get the door," Henry said, setting her gently on her feet and supporting her with one arm while he worked the latch with his free hand. The door swung open to reveal a simple but tidy interior, and Emma had never seen anything so welcoming in her life. Henry helped her inside, then quickly moved to stoke the banked fire in the stone hearth. "It's not much," he said as flames began to lick at fresh logs, "but it's dry and warm." Emma stood dripping on the plank floor, suddenly aware of how bedraggled she must look. Her traveling dress, once a serviceable blue wool, now clung to her like a second skin, and her carefully pinned hair had come loose to hang in wet ropes around her shoulders. "I need to get you something dry to wear," Henry said, turning to look at her. In the growing firelight, she could finally see him clearly, tall and broad-shouldered, with tanned skin that spoke of days spent outdoors. His eyes were a striking blue beneath dark brows, his features strong and weathered. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way of the men she'd known back in Philadelphia, but there was something compelling about his face, a kind of rugged integrity that made her feel safe. He moved to a trunk against the wall and began rummaging through it, eventually producing a cotton shirt and a pair of trousers that would clearly swallow her whole. "These will have to do until your clothes dry," he said, holding them out to her. "There's a screen in the corner you can change behind." Emma took the offered clothes with murmured thanks. Behind the screen, she peeled off her sodden garments with difficulty, her fingers stiff with cold. The shirt was enormous, reaching nearly to her knees, and she had to roll the sleeves up multiple times to free her hands. The trousers were hopeless. She could have fit inside one leg, so she settled for the shirt alone, hoping it provided enough modesty. When she emerged, Henry had his back to her, busy at the small stove in the corner. He'd removed his hat and coat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "I've put water on to heat," he said without turning. "For tea and to clean those scrapes on your hands." Emma moved closer to the fire, drawn by its warmth. "You're very kind, Mr. Forrester." He glanced over his shoulder then, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her in his shirt before he quickly returned his attention to the stove. "Just doing what anyone would," he said gruffly. "And I told you it's Hank." "Hank, then," Emma replied, feeling a strange flutter in her stomach at the familiarity. "May I ask, do you live here alone?" "Just me and my horse," he answered, pouring steaming water into a cup. "Been that way for 3 years now. No wife, family." The questions slipped out before she could stop them. Hank handed her the cup of tea, his face impassive. "Had family once, lost them in the war, never got around to starting one of my own." He didn't elaborate, and Emma didn't press. The war between the states had left many scars, both visible and hidden, on men throughout the country. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Hank nodded once in acknowledgement, then moved to hang her dress near the fire. "You mentioned needing to be in Fort Worth by morning," he said, clearly changing the subject. "What's waiting for you there?" Emma sipped her tea, grateful for its warmth. "A teaching position at the new school. At least, I hope it will be mine. I have an interview with the town council in the morning. You're a teacher. I was in Philadelphia. After my parents died, Emma faltered, surprised at how easily the pain still surfaced. "I needed a fresh start, somewhere far away where I could build something new." Hank considered her for a long moment. "Fort Worth's growing fast, rough around the edges, but there are good people there trying to build something worthwhile." He gestured to her ankle. "May I?" At her nod, he knelt and gently examined her injury. His hands were calloused but surprisingly gentle as he probed the swollen area. "It's not broken," he pronounced, "but you won't be walking on it tomorrow." Emma's heart sank. "But my interview, I'll get you there," Hank said simply, rising to his feet. "First light, we'll ride into town. It's only an hour if we take the proper trail, not that goat path you were attempting." "I couldn't impose, it's no imposition. I need supplies anyway." He moved to a cabinet and pulled out a jar and some clean cloth. "This is witch hazel for your scrapes." As he tended to her hands with careful attention, Emma studied his face. There was a scar along his jawline and another that nicked his left eyebrow. His face told a story of a life lived hard, yet there was a gentleness to his ministrations that belied his rugged exterior. "Have you lived in these parts long?" she asked, trying to distract herself from the tingling sensation his touch produced. "Since '75, he replied. "Came west after the war, worked cattle drives for a while, saved enough to buy this place 3 years ago." He finished wrapping a particularly deep cut on her palm. "Small spread, but it's mine. Got about 30 head of cattle, decent grazing land on the other side of the ridge." "It must be lonely," Emma said softly. Hank's eyes met hers briefly before he looked away. "You get used to it." He stood abruptly. "You should rest. Take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire." Emma began to protest, but he shook his head firmly. "I insist, you've had a harder day than most." The bed was a simple frame with a straw-filled mattress, but to Emma's exhausted body it felt like luxury itself. As she settled beneath the blankets, she watched Hank arrange his bedroll near the hearth, his movements efficient and practiced. "Hank," she called softly. He paused, looking over at her. "Thank you. Not just for saving me, but for—" She gestured around the cabin, unable to articulate everything she felt. He nodded once. "Get some sleep, Emma. Dawn comes early in these hills." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice followed her into dreams of falling and being caught by strong, sure hands. Emma woke to the scent of coffee and the sounds of quiet movement. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar ceiling above her a puzzle until memories of the previous night came flooding back. She sat up quickly, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles and the throbbing in her ankle. Hank stood at the stove, his back to her. He'd already dressed for the day in clean denims and a chambray shirt, his hair damp as if he'd washed it. "Morning," he said without turning. "Coffee's ready if you want some." Emma brushed her tangled hair back from her face, suddenly acutely aware of her state of undress beneath the blankets. "Thank you, I'll just need a moment," Hank nodded, still not looking at her. "Your dress is dry, I've left it by the screen, there's wash water in the basin there." He stepped outside to give her privacy, and Emma quickly made use of the water to clean her face and arms before slipping behind the screen to dress. Her gown was indeed dry, though wrinkled and still bearing the dirt and tears from her fall. She did her best to make herself presentable, plaiting her hair into a simple braid without her hairpins, which had been lost in the fall. When she emerged, Hank had returned with an armful of firewood. He glanced up at her, a flicker of something passing through his eyes before he set the wood beside the hearth. "How's the ankle?" he asked, straightening. Emma tested her weight on it gingerly. Tender, but I can walk if I'm careful. He nodded, then poured her a cup of coffee, adding a spoonful of sugar without asking. When he handed it to her, their fingers brushed, and Emma felt a curious warmth that had nothing to do with the hot liquid. "Thank you," she said, taking a sip. The coffee was strong and sweet, exactly how she liked it. "Made some Jonna cakes too," Hank said, motioning to a plate on the small table. "Not fancy, but they'll keep you going." They ate in companionable silence, the rain having given way to early morning sunshine that streamed through the cabin's single window. Emma found herself studying Hank as he ate, noticing the way the light caught in his hair, revealing threads of copper among the brown. "We should head out soon if you want to make that interview," he said finally, collecting their empty plates. "Town council usually meets at 9. "What time is it now?" Emma asked with sudden alarm. "Just after 7. We've got time." He moved to the door, then paused. "I've saddled my horse." "He's gentle, but you'll need to ride behind me with that ankle." Emma nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of nerves at the thought of being pressed against him for the journey. She'd never been particularly proper by Philadelphia standards. Her parents had been progressive thinkers who believed in education for women, but there were still boundaries of propriety to consider. Then again, those boundaries had already been crossed when she'd spent the night in his cabin wearing nothing but his shirt. "I'm ready whenever you are," she said, reaching for her shawl, the only item from her satchel that she still possessed. Outside, the world had been transformed by the storm. The air was crisp and clean, the sky a brilliant blue that stretched endlessly over the rugged landscape. Emma took a deep breath, savoring the scent of wet earth and pine. Hank's horse stood patiently nearby, a sturdy buckskin gelding with intelligent eyes. "This is Buck," Hank said, patting the animal's neck. "He's carried me through worse than a mountain trail." He helped Emma mount, his hands strong and sure around her waist as he lifted her, then swung up behind her with practiced ease. Emma found herself cradled between his arms as he took the reins, her back against his chest, her head fitting neatly beneath his chin. "Comfortable?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. She'd never been this close to a man before, and the solid strength of him surrounding her was both disconcerting and strangely comforting. They set off down a trail that wound along the ridge before descending gradually toward the plains below. The motion of the horse was soothing, and despite the intimacy of their position, Emma found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the ride. Hank was silent behind her, his attention seemingly focused on guiding the horse along the safest path. "You mentioned you were a teacher in Philadelphia," he said after they'd been riding for some time. "What did you teach?" "Everything," Emma replied. "It was a small school, reading, writing, arithmetic, some history and natural philosophy. I enjoy literature most, though." "Educated woman," Hank observed. There was no judgment in his tone, merely acknowledgement. "My father was a professor," Emma explained. "He believed girls should have the same opportunities for learning as boys." Sounds like a forward-thinking man. He was. Emma felt the familiar ache of loss, but it was tempered now by fond remembrance. "He would have liked the idea of me coming west, starting fresh. My mother would have been horrified, though." She smiled at the thought. "She was always trying to arrange a suitable marriage for me, but I was too stubborn." "No suitors back in Philadelphia, then?" Hank asked, his tone casual. Emma shook her head. "None that interested me. Most men don't want a wife who corrects their grammar or questions their politics." She felt rather than heard his low chuckle, a rumble against her back. "Their loss," he said simply. The trail widened as they continued downward, eventually giving way to a broader path that showed signs of regular use. In the distance, Emma could make out wisps of smoke rising from chimneys and the faint outlines of buildings Fort Worth growing closer with each step of Buck's steady pace. "We'll be there in 20 minutes or so," Hank said. "Town council meets at the hotel. I'll take you there first." As they rode, Emma found herself torn between excitement for what lay ahead and an inexplicable reluctance to reach their destination. The events of the previous night seemed dreamlike now in the clear light of day, yet the solid presence of the man behind her was undeniably real. "Hank," she said suddenly, "I don't know how to thank you properly for what you've done." His arms tightened slightly around her. "No need for thanks. Like I said, just doing what anyone would do." "Not anyone would have been there on that trail in a storm or offered a stranger shelter, or let's just say I'm glad I was there," he interrupted, his voice gruff. "And that you're all right." They fell into silence again, but it was charged now with things unsaid, with the awareness that their brief acquaintance was drawing to a close. Emma found herself memorizing the feel of him, the steady rise and fall of his chest against her back, the secure circle of his arms, the scent of leather and soap that surrounded her. Fort Worth rose before them, a bustling frontier town that had grown rapidly with the arrival of the railroad just 2 years prior. Cattle pens lined the outskirts, evidence of the city's importance as a shipping point for Texas livestock. The main street was already busy with morning activity, shopkeepers opening their establishments, wagons delivering goods, cowboys and townspeople going about their business. Hank guided Buck expertly through the traffic, drawing up finally before a 2-story building with a sign proclaiming it the Lone Star Hotel. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Emma down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "This is where the council meets," he said, nodding toward the building. "In the dining room, usually?" Emma straightened her wrinkled dress as best she could, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "I must look a fright," she murmured. "Hardly the impression I hoped to make." Hank's eyes swept over her, taking in the torn hem of her dress, the simple braid, the fading scrape on her cheek. "You look like a woman who survived a fall off a cliff," he said seriously. "If they can't see your worth beyond that, they don't deserve you as their teacher." The unexpected compliment warmed Emma more than she cared to admit. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Hank shifted uncomfortably, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I've got some errands to run in town, supplies to pick up." He hesitated. "The interview shouldn't take more than an hour. I could meet you back here after if you'd like, help you find lodgings." "I'd appreciate that," Emma said, relief washing through her. The thought of navigating a strange town alone with no belongings and a tender ankle had been weighing on her. Hank nodded once decisively. "1 hour, then." He turned to go, then paused, reaching into his pocket. He pressed something into her hand, coins enough to pay for a meal and perhaps a room for the night. "Just in case," he said gruffly, and was gone before she could protest, leading Buck toward the livery stable down the street. Emma watched him go, her emotions in turmoil. In less than a day, this stranger had become her rescuer, her host, her what? Friend seemed too small a word for the connection she felt, yet anything more was surely impossible after such a brief acquaintance. Squaring her shoulders, Emma turned toward the hotel entrance. Whatever the future held, she had an interview to attend and a position to secure. The rest would have to wait. The Lone Star Hotel's dining room was imposing in its frontier-way, large windows letting in morning light, tables with actual linen cloths, a massive stone fireplace along one wall. At a round table near the center sat 4 men in varying stages of middle age, all dressed in the somber suits of town officials. Emma approached with as much dignity as her sore ankle would allow, her chin lifted despite her bedraggled appearance. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm Emma Ainsworth. I believe you're expecting me for an interview regarding the teaching position." The men looked up, surprise registering on their faces as they took in her condition. The oldest among them, a portly gentleman with impressive whiskers, rose to his feet. "Miss Ainsworth, indeed. We had nearly given you up for lost. The stage arrived yesterday without you, and there was some concern." He trailed off, gesturing to her appearance. "I apologize for my state, sir," Emma said. "The stagecoach broke down some miles out of town, and I attempted to walk the rest of the way. There was an Incident on the mountain trail during the storm. She saw no need to relate the entire harrowing tale. Fortunately, I was assisted by a local rancher who brought me safely to town this morning. Remarkable, said another councilman, a thin man with spectacles. Quite remarkable. Please sit down, Miss Ainsworth. You must be exhausted. They offered her a chair, and to Emma's relief, a cup of hot coffee. The interview proceeded more as a conversation than an interrogation, with the councilmen representing Fort Worth's growing business interests, eager to hear about her qualifications and teaching philosophy. We've had 3 schools already, but they've all failed for lack of a committed teacher, explained Mr. Harrison, the whiskered chairman. Fort Worth is growing rapidly. The railroad has brought new families, and these families have children in need of education. We can offer a salary of $40 per month, added Mr. Whitaker, the bespectacled member. And there's a small cottage behind the schoolhouse where the teacher traditionally lodges. Emma's heart lifted. The salary was more than she'd hoped, and the inclusion of housing solved her most immediate concern. How many students would I be expected to teach? She asked. Currently 27, ranging from 6 to 16 years, Mr. Harrison replied. A mixed group, some quite advanced, others barely literate. I'm accustomed to teaching multiple grade levels simultaneously, Emma assured them. In Philadelphia, I had 32 students across 8 grades. The men exchanged pleased glances. And when could you start, Miss Ainsworth? Asked the third councilman, a younger man named Parker. Immediately, Emma replied without hesitation. Though I'm afraid I've lost all my belongings in the journey, I would need a day or 2 to acquire basic necessities. Of course, Mr. Harrison said. In fact, I believe my wife has some clothing that might suit you in the meantime. She's always collecting items for those in need. By the time the hour had passed, Emma had been officially offered the position, provided with a small advance on her salary, and invited to dinner at the Harrison home that evening. As she rose to leave, feeling slightly dazed by the swift turn of events, Mr. Parker added one final piece of information. The school term begins Monday next, Miss Ainsworth. That gives you 4 days to settle in and prepare. Mr. Whitaker here will show you to the schoolhouse and cottage this afternoon, once you've had a chance to rest and refresh yourself. His eyes flickered briefly over her torn dress. Thank you, gentlemen, Emma said, overwhelmed by their kindness. I won't let you down. She stepped out into the bright sunshine, her mind spinning with all that had happened in the past 24 hours. From the brink of disaster to secured employment and housing in the span of a day, it seemed almost miraculous. Hank was waiting for her as promised, leaning against a hitching post across the street, his hat pulled low over his eyes. When he spotted her, he straightened, crossing to meet her with long strides. How did it go? He asked, his eyes searching her face. Emma couldn't contain her smile. I got the position. I start Monday, and they've even provided housing a cottage behind the schoolhouse. Hank's expression warmed, the corners of his eyes crinkling. I knew they'd have sense enough to hire you. They were very understanding about my appearance and the lost luggage, Emma continued. Mrs. Harrison is even lending me some clothing until I can purchase my own. Oh, and they're paying me $40 a month. That's more than I made in Philadelphia. Sounds like things are looking up, Hank observed, his voice holding a note she couldn't quite identify. Was it satisfaction, regret, thanks to you? Emma said softly. If you hadn't been on that trail last night. Hank shook his head. Let's not think about that. He glanced up at the sun. Have you eaten? I was thinking of getting some dinner at the cafe down the street before heading back. Emma's heart sank at the reminder that he would be returning to his mountain cabin. Of course, she had known their paths would diverge, but the prospect now filled her with unexpected sadness. I'd like that, she said, forcing brightness into her voice. Though I should warn you, I've been invited to dine with the Harrisons this evening. Popular already, Hank commented with a small smile. That's good. Fort Worth's a friendly town once you get to know it. They walked together to a small cafe nestled between a dry goods store and a gunsmith shop. Inside, the atmosphere was homey and welcoming, with checkered tablecloths and the aroma of fresh baked bread. A motherly woman named Mrs. Bentley showed them to a corner table, clucking sympathetically when Emma briefly explained her mishap on the trail. "You poor dear," she exclaimed. "Thank the Lord Mr. Forrester found you. He's got a reputation for being in the right place at the right time." Hank looked uncomfortable at the praise. "Just lucky timing," he muttered. Mrs. Bentley patted his shoulder. "Don't let him fool you, miss. He's pulled more than one person out of trouble over the years. Remember that Fletcher boy who got lost hunting last winter? Hank here tracked him through a blizzard, carried him 5 miles back to town." Emma glanced at Hank with new interest as Mrs. Bentley moved away to fetch their food. "You didn't mention you were the local hero." Hank's face flushed beneath his tan. "I'm nothing of the sort. Just happen to know those mountains better than most. And just happen to be riding a dangerous trail in a thunderstorm." Emma pressed gently. Hank met her eyes then. "I take that trail sometimes when I want to be alone. There's a view from the ridge, helps clear my head." Something in his tone made Emma want to reach across the table and take his hand, but she restrained herself. They were, after all, barely acquainted, despite the intensity of their brief connection. Their meal arrived: thick slices of roast beef, potatoes swimming in gravy, fresh bread still warm from the oven. As they ate, conversation flowed more easily than Emma would have expected. Hank asked about her teaching experience, and she found herself sharing stories of particularly memorable students, of lessons gone awry, of small triumphs in the classroom. In turn, she drew him out about his ranch, the challenges of raising cattle in the hills, his plans to expand his herd, the mare that was due to foal in the spring. His face transformed when he spoke of his land, the customary reserve giving way to quiet passion. "It's not much compared to some spreads," he admitted, "but it's good land. The water never dries up even in August, and the grass stays green longer than down on the plains." "It sounds beautiful," Emma said sincerely. "It is." Hank's eyes met hers. "You should see it in spring when the wildflowers carpet the meadows, like someone spilled a box of paints across the hills." The invitation hung in the air between them, unspoken but palpable. Emma felt a flush rise to her cheeks and looked down at her empty plate. "Perhaps I will someday." The moment stretched, taut with possibility, before Mrs. Bentley appeared with slices of apple pie, breaking the spell. They ate the dessert in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When it came time to pay, Hank waved away Emma's attempt to use the coins he had given her earlier. "Keep it," he said firmly. "You'll need it until you get your first month's wages." Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the dusty street. They stood awkwardly for a moment, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "Mr. Whitaker is going to show me the schoolhouse later," Emma said, "and I should find Mrs. Harrison about those clothes." Hank nodded, his eyes on the distant mountains. "I should head back, got animals to tend to, of course." Emma took a deep breath. "Hank, I don't know how I can ever repay you for what you've done." He turned to her then, his expression serious. "There's nothing to repay, I'm just glad I was there." Emma extended her hand. "Then goodbye and thank you again." Hank took her hand, his much larger one engulfing hers. Instead of shaking it, he simply held it for a long moment, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. "Goodbye, Emma Ainsworth." He hesitated. "I come to town for supplies every couple of weeks. Perhaps I'll see you then." "I'd like that," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. He released her hand reluctantly, touched the brim of his hat in farewell, and turned toward the livery. Emma watched him go, his tall figure easily visible among the crowd until he disappeared around a corner. Only then did she realize she was still clutching the coins he had given her, the metal warm from being held tightly in her palm. With a sigh that contained more emotions than she cared to analyze, Emma turned and made her way back toward the hotel to find Mr. Whitaker. The schoolhouse stood on the eastern edge of town, a simple frame building with large windows and a bell tower that seemed slightly out of proportion to the rest of the structure. Behind it, nestled beneath the spreading branches of a massive oak tree, was the teacher's cottage, a snug, one-room dwelling with a small porch and a stone chimney. "It's not fancy," Mr. Whittaker apologized as he unlocked the door, "but it's sound and weather-tight." The previous teacher left some furnishings. Inside, Emma found a narrow bed, a pine table with 2 chairs, a small dresser, and a rocking chair pulled close to the hearth. A shelf along one wall held a few books, mostly basic primers, and a worn Bible. The space was dusty and had the slightly stale smell of a place long unopened, but Emma could already see its potential. "It's perfect," she told Mr. Whittaker sincerely. "A bit of cleaning, some curtains perhaps." "Mrs. Whittaker mentioned she has some fabric you might use," he offered. "She's quite handy with a needle and would be happy to help." "That's very kind," Emma said, touched by the generosity of these strangers who were rapidly becoming neighbors. After Mr. Whittaker left, promising to send his wife over in the morning with the fabric and perhaps some fresh baking, Emma explored the cottage more thoroughly. There was a small pantry with basic cooking implements, a pump in the corner that delivered cold, clear water, and even a door at the back that opened onto a tiny garden plot, currently overrun with weeds but full of promise. The schoolhouse itself was larger than she had expected, with rows of sturdy desks, a well-used blackboard, and shelves containing a modest collection of books and supplies. Emma ran her fingers over the teacher's desk at the front of the room, imagining herself standing before it, guiding young minds toward knowledge. It was more than she had dared hope for when she'd set out from Philadelphia, a position of respect, a home of her own, a community that seemed eager to welcome her. And yet, as she returned to the cottage and began clearing away cobwebs with a broom she found in the corner, Emma couldn't help but think of a mountain cabin and the man who inhabited it. The memory of his strong hands pulling her to safety, of his arms around her as they rode through the morning, of the warmth in his blue eyes when he'd said goodbye, these thoughts returned unbidden, bringing with them a longing she had no right to feel for someone who was, in essence, still a stranger. "Foolishness," she murmured to herself, attacking a particularly stubborn corner with the broom. "Schoolgirl fancies brought on by dramatic circumstances." Yet even as she dismissed her feelings, Emma found herself wondering when Hank would next come to town for supplies, and whether he had meant it when he'd said he would seek her out. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Mr. Harrison sent his wife over that very evening with a bundle of clothing that, while slightly too large for Emma's slender frame, were clean and serviceable. Mrs. Harrison, a cheerful woman with graying hair and kind eyes, immediately took Emma under her wing, introducing her to other prominent ladies in the town during a dinner that was more welcoming committee than formal affair. "You must meet everyone," she insisted, linking her arm through Emma's as they walked to her home. "Fort Worth may be growing, but we're still a close community at heart." By the end of the evening, Emma had been introduced to the doctor and his wife, the banker, the minister, and what seemed like half the merchants in town. All expressed enthusiasm about the new school term and offered whatever assistance she might need. The following days were filled with preparations. Mrs. Whittaker arrived as promised with curtain fabric and freshly baked bread. Other neighbors appeared with house-warming gifts, a quilt, preserved fruits, a small rug for the floor. The general store owner extended credit until her first payday, allowing Emma to purchase essential items. On Saturday, 2 days before school was to begin, a group of students and their parents arrived at the schoolhouse for what Mrs. Harrison called a working bee. Together they scrubbed floors, washed windows, repaired broken desks, and cleared the overgrown yard. Emma worked alongside them, getting to know her future pupils as they labored together. Miss Ainsworth, called a voice as she was arranging books on a shelf. She turned to find a girl of about 15 watching her with curious eyes. "Is it true you nearly fell off Deadman's Cliff and were rescued by Mr. Forrester?" Emma blinked in surprise. Yes, though I didn't know the place had such an ominous name." The girl nodded sagely. "3 people have died there in the last 10 years. They say there's a curse on that trail. That's why nobody uses it except Mr. Forrester." She leaned closer. "Some folks say he's haunted by something. That's why he rides dangerous paths alone." Mary Beth Cooper. A woman's voice cut through the conversation. "Stop pestering Miss Ainsworth with gossip." The girl flushed and hurried away, leaving Emma thoughtful. Was that why Hank had been on that treacherous trail during a storm? What ghosts drove a man to seek solitude in such dangerous places? By Sunday evening, the schoolhouse was ready, the cottage was clean and comfortable, and Emma had prepared her first week's lessons. She sat in her rocking chair before the hearth, a cup of tea in hand, marveling at how quickly her life had transformed. Just 1 week ago, she had been on a stagecoach heading west, full of uncertainty and trepidation. Now she had a position, a home, and the beginnings of friendships in this frontier community. Yet as she gazed into the flames, her thoughts drifted once again to the mountains visible from her window, and to the man who made his home among them. In the days since their parting, Emma had heard Hank's name mentioned several times, always with respect, occasionally with curiosity about the reclusive rancher, as some called him. "Keeps to himself, mostly," the blacksmith had commented when Emma casually inquired. "Good man, though. Fair in his dealings, helpful in a pinch. Saved my Jacob during that blizzard last winter," added Mrs. Cooper, Mary Beth's mother. "Wouldn't take so much as a thank-you dinner afterward, just tipped his hat and rode back to his mountain." Each snippet added to the portrait Emma was forming of Henry Forrester, a man of few words but decisive actions, respected but not truly known by the townspeople who benefited from his quiet heroism. She wondered what had shaped him, what had driven him to seek solitude in the wilderness while still extending a helping hand to those in need. And she wondered, with a flutter in her stomach that she tried to ignore, when she would see him again. The answer came sooner than she expected. On Monday morning, Emma rose before dawn, eager and nervous for her first day of teaching. She dressed carefully in her best borrowed dress, pinned her hair in a neat bun, and walked to the schoolhouse just as the sun was beginning to light the eastern sky. She was arranging papers on her desk, mentally reviewing her welcome speech when a shadow darkened the doorway. Looking up, Emma felt her heart skip at the sight of Hank standing in the entrance, hat in hand. "Good morning, Miss Ainsworth," he said formally, though his eyes held a warmth that belied the stiffness of his greeting. "Mr. Forrester," she replied, suddenly breathless. "This is an unexpected pleasure." He stepped into the room, glancing around at the freshly cleaned space. "Place looks good, better than it has in years. We had a working bee on Saturday," Emma explained. "The whole community pitched in." Hank nodded, then reached into his coat and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you something for your first day." Emma accepted the package with surprise. "You didn't have to, I know," he interrupted. "I wanted to." She carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a small wooden box, beautifully crafted with an inlaid design of wildflowers on the lid. Opening it, she found a collection of pencils, a pen with several nibs, and a small bottle of ink. "Oh, Hank," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "It's beautiful. Made the box myself," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Thought you might need writing implements." "It's perfect, thank you." Emma looked up at him, touched beyond measure by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "But what brings you to town today? I thought you only came every couple of weeks." A flush crept up Hank's neck. "Had some business with the blacksmith," he said vaguely. "Thought I'd stop by, wish you luck on your first day." Before Emma could respond, the sound of children's voices approached the schoolhouse. Hank stepped back, replacing his hat. "I should go," he said. "Don't want to interfere with your teaching." "You wouldn't be," Emma assured him quickly, then caught herself. but I understand you have errands to attend to." Hank hesitated at the door. "I'll be in town again next week. Supply wagon comes in on Wednesday." It wasn't quite a question, but the invitation was clear in his eyes. "I'll remember that," Emma said softly, with a nod and a touch to his hat brim. Hank was gone, passing the first arriving students on the path. Emma watched him go, clutching the wooden box to her chest, a smile spreading across her face despite her efforts to maintain a professional demeanor. The day passed in a blur of introductions, assessments, and establishing routines. Emma found her students to be a diverse group, from the Cooper twins, Mary Beth and her brother Mark, who were clearly bright but restless, to little Sarah Jenkins, who could barely form her letters, to Tom Williams, a serious 16-year-old who worked his family's farm in the mornings and afternoons, but was determined to continue his education during the midday hours. By the final bell, Emma was exhausted but exhilarated. The classroom hummed with potential, and she had already identified strengths and challenges in each of her pupils. As she stood on the schoolhouse steps, watching the last children disappear down the road toward home, Emma felt a deep sense of rightness. This was where she was meant to be. That evening, as she sat at her small table preparing the next day's lessons, her gaze kept returning to the wooden box Hank had given her. Running her fingers over the inlaid flowers, she marveled at the skill it must have taken to create such delicate work. It revealed a side of him she hadn't glimpsed during their brief acquaintance, an artistic sensibility beneath the rugged exterior. Wednesday suddenly seemed very far away. The week settled into a pattern: mornings and afternoons filled with teaching, evenings devoted to lesson preparation, and getting to know her neighbors. Emma found herself welcomed into the social fabric of Fort Worth with an ease that surprised her. There were invitations to dinners, to church socials, even a tentative courtship overture from the young deputy sheriff that she gently deflected. Yet through it all, her thoughts frequently turned to the mountains and to Hank. She found herself watching the trail that led from town up into the hills, wondering if he might appear unexpectedly as he had on Monday morning. When Wednesday finally arrived, Emma found herself taking extra care with her appearance, selecting her most flattering borrowed dress and arranging her hair with particular attention. She told herself it was simply because she would be going into town after school to purchase supplies with her first advance, but the flutter in her stomach when she thought of possibly encountering Hank told a different story. The supply wagon arrived at midday, drawing a small crowd to the general store where goods from the eastern states were unloaded, everything from canned goods to yard goods to the latest catalogs and newspapers. Emma dismissed her class promptly at 4 o'clock and made her way to Main Street, trying to appear casual as she perused the newly arrived merchandise while scanning the store for a familiar tall figure. There was no sign of Hank. Disappointment settled in her chest, though she chided herself for it. He had said he would be in town, not that he would seek her out specifically. Perhaps he had already come and gone, or perhaps his plans had changed. She made her purchases: fabric for a new dress, some basic foodstuffs, a few personal items, and was about to leave when she overheard a conversation between the storekeeper and a grizzled old-timer lounging near the door. "Forrester was in earlier," the old man was saying. "Bought his usual supplies plus some fancy tea. Never known him to drink tea before. Said something about having company up at his place soon," the storekeeper replied. "First I've heard of Hank Forrester entertaining visitors. Usually values his privacy, that one." Emma nearly dropped the package she was holding. Company? At his ranch? Who could he be expecting? And why did the thought fill her with such irrational jealousy? She was still pondering this as she made her way back toward the schoolhouse, her steps slower than usual despite the heavy packages in her arms. Lost in thought, she didn't notice the approaching rider until he was almost upon her. "Need some help with those packages, Miss Ainsworth." Emma looked up with a start to find Hank gazing down at her from atop buck, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Mr. Forrester," she exclaimed, unable to hide her pleasure despite her earlier doubts. "I wasn't sure I would see you today." He swung down from the saddle, taking the heaviest parcels from her arms. "Told you I'd be in town on Wednesday," he said simply, as if there had never been any question about his appearance. "These going to the schoolhouse?" Emma nodded, falling into step beside him as he led Buck by the reins. "I've been spending most of my advance on classroom supplies," she explained. "Books, slate pencils, paper. How's the teaching going?" he asked, genuine interest in his voice. "Wonderfully," Emma replied with enthusiasm. "The children are eager to learn and the parents are supportive. I've already seen progress in just these few days." As they walked, Emma found herself sharing stories of her first week, Tom Williams' insightful essay on agriculture, little Sarah's breakthrough with her letters, the Cooper twins' mischievous but good-natured pranks. Hank listened attentively, asking questions that revealed a surprising understanding of educational challenges. "You sound like you've had experience with teaching," Emma observed as they reached the schoolhouse. Hank shrugged, setting her packages on the porch steps. "My mother was a teacher before she married my father. Grew up listening to her talk about her students." It was the first personal detail he had shared about his family, and Emma treasured it even as she yearned to know more. She must have been very dedicated. She was. His expression softened with memory. "Believed education was the most important gift you could give a child, more valuable than any material possession." "I believe that too," Emma said quietly. Their eyes met, and for a moment the connection between them felt almost tangible. Then Hank cleared his throat and glanced away. "I was wondering," he said, his voice gruffer than before, "if you might like to see more of the countryside around Fort Worth. Sunday, perhaps, after church. Weather's supposed to be fine." Emma's heart leapt. "Are you asking me to go riding with you, Mr. Forrester?" A flush crept up from beneath his collar. "I am. If you'd like to, that is." "I would like that very much," Emma replied, trying to keep her voice measured despite the excitement bubbling within her. "I'll bring an extra horse," Hank said, visibly relieved by her acceptance. "Meet you here at noon," Emma nodded. "I'll pack a lunch if you'd like." "That would be nice." He hesitated, then added, "Looking forward to it, Miss Ainsworth." "Emma," she corrected gently. "After all we've been through, I think you can call me Emma." A smile spread across his face, transforming his features. "Emma," he repeated, as if savoring the sound of it. "Until Sunday, then." As he mounted Buck and rode away, Emma hugged herself, giddy with anticipation. A proper outing together, not a rescue, not a chance encounter, but a deliberate plan to spend time in each other's company. What did it mean? And why did the prospect fill her with such joy? The next few days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Emma threw herself into her teaching, started sewing her new dress in the evenings, and tried not to spend every waking moment thinking about Sunday's excursion. She failed miserably at the latter, finding herself daydreaming about what they might talk about, where he might take her, whether he felt the same inexplicable connection that she did. By Sunday morning, her new dress was finished, a simple but becoming garment of deep blue cotton that set off her eyes. She wore it to church, where she received several compliments, but it was the approval in Hank's eyes when he arrived at the schoolhouse at noon that mattered most to her. He had brought a gentle mare for her to ride, a pretty sorrel with a white blaze. "This is Daisy," he said, helping Emma mount. "She belongs to the livery stable, but I've ridden her before. She's steady and sweet-tempered." They set off at an easy pace, following a trail that wound along the river before climbing into the foothills. The day was perfect, clear skies, a gentle breeze, wildflowers nodding along the path. Emma found herself relaxing in the saddle, enjoying the rhythm of riding side by side rather than the more intimate but less conversational arrangement of their first journey together. Hank was different today, more open, less guarded. He pointed out landmarks, shared stories of the area's history, even laughed aloud at Emma's tale of catching the Cooper twins trying to put a lizard in her desk drawer. By the time they reached the overlook he had chosen for their picnic, a grassy plateau with a stunning view of the valley below, Emma felt as if she had known him for years rather than days. They spread the blanket Emma had brought beneath the shade of a lone oak tree. The lunch was simple fried chicken, biscuits, apple tarts, but Hank ate with appreciation, complimenting her cooking with genuine enthusiasm. "Haven't had a meal this good in longer than I can remember," he admitted. "Usually make do with whatever's quickest." "You should come to dinner sometime," Emma suggested, then blushed at her own forwardness. "I mean, I enjoy cooking, and it's no fun preparing a proper meal just for oneself." Hank studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I'd like that," he said finally. "Though folks might talk if I started calling on you regularly." "Let them talk," Emma replied with more boldness than she felt. "I'm allowed to have friends, aren't I? Is that what we are, friends?" Hank's voice was soft, his eyes intent on hers. Emma's breath caught. "I'd like to think so," she said carefully, "though we haven't known each other long. Sometimes time isn't the measure of such things." Hank reached out slowly, as if giving her a chance to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear that had escaped from her pins. The touch was feather-light, but Emma felt it like a brand upon her skin. "No," she agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes it isn't." For a heartbeat, she thought he might lean closer, might bridge the distance between them. Then a hawk cried overhead, breaking the spell, and Hank drew back, clearing his throat. "I should show you the waterfall before we head back," he said, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. "It's just a short walk from here." The moment had passed, but a current of awareness remained between them as they packed up the remains of their lunch and left the horses to graze. The path to the waterfall was narrow, forcing them to walk single file, but Hank frequently turned to offer his hand over rough patches, each touch sending a thrill through Emma's veins. The waterfall itself was worth the journey, a silver ribbon of water cascading down a rock face into a crystal-clear pool below. The sound of it filled the small clearing, a constant, soothing rush that seemed to wash away the tension of the past week. "It's beautiful," Emma breathed, enchanted by the play of light on water. "One of my favorite places," Hank admitted, watching her reaction with evident pleasure. "I come here when I need to think, or just to listen to something besides my own thoughts." Emma glanced at him, struck by the vulnerability in his admission. "Do you get lonely up on your mountain?" she asked softly. Hank was silent for a long moment, gazing at the falling water. "Used to think I preferred it that way," he said finally. "After the war, after losing my family. Solitude seemed safer, simpler." He turned to look at her, his blue eyes intense. "Not so sure about that anymore." Emma's heart raced at the implication. "What changed?" she asked, though she thought she knew the answer. Before he could respond, a distant rumble of thunder broke the moment. They both looked up to see dark clouds gathering on the western horizon, moving swiftly in their direction. "Storm's coming," Hank said, all business now. "We should head back before it hits." They hurried back to the horses, but the storm moved faster than anticipated. They were only halfway down the trail when the first fat raindrops began to fall, quickly becoming a steady downpour that soaked them within minutes. "My cabin's closer than town," Hank shouted over the increasingly heavy rain. "We should wait it out there." Emma nodded, water streaming down her face, her new dress plastered to her body. They urged the horses to a faster pace, following a different trail than the one they had ascended. Despite the discomfort of the sudden drenching, Emma found herself experiencing a strange sense of déjà vu, once again caught in a storm with Hank, once again seeking shelter in his cabin. By the time they reached the small ranch, the storm was in full fury, lightning splitting the sky, thunder rolling through the mountains like cannon fire. They stabled the horses quickly, then made a dash for the cabin, arriving on the porch breathless and dripping. Inside, the cabin was just as Emma remembered it, simple, neat, masculine in its sparse furnishings. Hank moved immediately to light the fire, his movements efficient despite his sodden clothing. You need to get out of those wet things, he said, not looking at her as the fire caught and began to spread warmth through the room. I'll step outside while you change. Into what? Emma asked practically, though she was shivering now that they were out of the rain. Hank paused, then went to the trunk where he had found clothing for her once before. Same arrangement as last time, he said, producing the oversized shirt. It's clean. I'll find you a blanket for the rest of you. He placed the garments on the bed, then took dry clothes for himself and stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him. Emma quickly peeled off her ruined dress, her petticoats, even her corset, which had become a sodden, uncomfortable cage around her ribs. The shirt was voluminous enough to preserve her modesty, falling nearly to her knees, though she wrapped the offered blanket around her waist for good measure. A knock at the door signaled Hank's return. "Decent," he called. "Yes," Emma replied, suddenly shy despite having been in this exact situation once before. Hank entered, now dressed in dry denims and a clean shirt, his wet hair slicked back from his face. He carried their soaked outer garments, which he hung carefully near the fire to dry. "I'm sorry about your dress," he said, noticing her examining the bedraggled blue fabric. "It was pretty. Thank you. I just finished making it yesterday." Emma wrapped her arms around herself, still chilled despite the growing warmth from the fire. Hank frowned in concern. "You're freezing," he observed. He moved to the stove, setting a kettle to boil. "Tea will help, and come closer to the fire." Emma obeyed, settling on a stool he placed near the hearth. The heat was heavenly after the cold rain, and she extended her hands toward the flames, grateful for their warmth. Hank busied himself preparing tea, his back to her as he worked. There was a domesticity to the scene that struck Emma forcibly, the two of them sharing this space, performing simple tasks, comfortable in each other's presence despite the unusual circumstances. "You think the storm will last long?" she asked, breaking the companionable silence. Hank glanced out the window where rain still lashed against the glass. "Hard to say. These mountain storms can blow through quickly or settle in for hours." He brought her a steaming cup. "Either way, the trail will be treacherous for a while after. Might be best if you stay until morning." Emma's pulse quickened at the suggestion, though she knew it was merely practical. "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition," Hank said, his voice gentle. "I'd rather know you're safe here than risk the trails in the dark, especially after rain." "Then thank you," Emma replied, sipping the hot tea gratefully. "I accept your hospitality once again." Hank settled on a chair near her, his own cup cradled in his large hands. "Becoming something of a habit, isn't it?" There was a hint of humor in his voice. "You, me, and storms." Emma smiled over the rim of her cup. "It does seem to be our pattern." "Not that I'm complaining," Hank added quietly, his eyes meeting hers over the firelight. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken feelings. Emma found herself remembering his words from earlier, before the storm interrupted them. Not so sure about preferring solitude anymore. The implication had been clear, and now, trapped together by another storm, it seemed impossible to ignore the growing connection between them. "Hank," she began, setting down her cup. "Before, at the waterfall, you were saying something about what had changed." He was still for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the fire. When he looked up again, his expression was open, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "You," he said simply. "You changed things, Emma," her breath caught. "How?" Hank set his own cup aside and leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. "I've been alone a long time, by choice mostly. After the war, after losing my parents to fever and my brother at Gettysburg. I didn't want to risk caring about anyone again." He ran a hand through his damp hair. "So I came west, worked cattle drives, kept moving. When I bought this place, it was because I wanted somewhere that was mine, but also somewhere apart, somewhere I could live without entanglements. And now—" Emma prompted softly when he fell silent. "And now I find myself riding into town on the flimsiest excuses, just to catch a glimpse of you," Hank admitted, a rueful smile touching his lips. Buying tea I don't drink because I thought you might visit someday. Carving a box when I should have been mending fences. He shook his head. It makes no sense, we barely know each other. Doesn't it? Emma countered. Makes sense, I mean, because I feel it too, Hank, this connection, as if we've known each other much longer than we have. He looked up sharply, hope and wariness warring in his expression. You do? Emma nodded, gathering her courage. I find myself watching the trail from town, wondering when you'll appear, thinking about you when I should be concentrating on lessons. Counting the days until Wednesday because you said you'd be in town. Hank moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. Emma, he said, her name a caress on his lips. I never expected to feel this way again or at all. But from the moment I pulled you up from that cliff, something changed in me. Something woke up that I thought was dead and buried. Emma's heart soared at his words, at the tender way he held her hands, at the warmth in his eyes that had nothing to do with the firelight. I was running away, you know, she confessed. From memories, from grief. I came west to escape, to start fresh where nothing would remind me of what I'd lost. She squeezed his hands. I never expected to find someone that would make me feel like I was coming home instead of leaving it behind. Hank raised one hand to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as a whisper. May I kiss you, Emma Ainsworth? He asked, his voice husky. In answer, Emma leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met softly at first, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened as Hank's arms encircled her, drawing her closer. Emma's hands found their way to his shoulders, then his neck, finally threading into his still damp hair as the kiss intensified. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Hank rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. I've been wanting to do that since I first saw you in Fort Worth, he admitted. Emma smiled, her heart too full for words. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the cabin, a different kind of tempest had been unleashed, one that promised not destruction but renewal, not loss but discovery. They spent the evening talking by the fire, sharing stories of their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Hank spoke of his childhood in Virginia, of his father's small farm, of the war that had torn his family apart. Emma told him of her parents' progressive ideals, of her determination to honor their memory by continuing to teach, of her loneliness after their deaths. As the night deepened, Hank insisted Emma take the bed while he made his bedroll by the fire, just as he had during her first stay. This time, however, there was a kiss goodnight, lingering and sweet, before they separated to their respective sleeping places. Emma lay awake for some time, listening to the rain and to Hank's steady breathing across the room. A week ago, she would have been scandalized by her current situation alone in a cabin with a man she barely knew, having exchanged kisses and confidences by firelight. Yet somehow it felt right, as if the conventional path of courtship had been unnecessary for them, replaced by the intensity of their shared experiences. She drifted off to sleep with a smile on her lips, more content than she had been in longer than she could remember. Morning brought clear skies and birdsong. Emma woke to the aroma of coffee and the sound of Hank moving quietly about the cabin, trying not to disturb her. She opened her eyes to find him setting the table for breakfast, his back to her, humming softly under his breath. Good morning, she said, sitting up and running a hand over her tousled hair. Hank turned, a smile breaking across his face at the sight of her. Good morning, he replied. Sleep well. Better than I have in months, Emma admitted. She glanced toward the window. The storm's passed. Left a clear day behind it, Hank agreed. Thought we might have breakfast before heading back to town. Your dress is mostly dry. Emma rose, clutching the blanket around her waist as she retrieved her dress from where it hung by the fire. It was indeed nearly dry, though somewhat wrinkled. I'll just change, she said, disappearing behind the screen when she emerged, dressed but with her hair loose around her shoulders, having lost her pins in the storm. Hank was watching her with an expression that made her blush. What? She asked, self-consciously smoothing her skirt. "You're beautiful," he said simply. "With your hair down like that, like some wild mountain flower." The compliment warmed her more deeply than she would have thought possible. "Thank you," she murmured, moving to join him at the table. Breakfast was simple but satisfying: flapjacks, bacon, strong coffee. They ate in companionable silence, exchanging glances that spoke volumes, their newfound intimacy both exciting and comfortable at once. As they prepared to leave, Hank helped Emma mount Daisy, his hands lingering at her waist. "I'll come by the schoolhouse tomorrow," he said, looking up at her. "If that's all right." "More than all right," Emma assured him, reaching down to touch his cheek. He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, the gesture unexpectedly tender from such a rugged man. "Thank you for the storm," he said with a small smile. Emma laughed. "I think I should be thanking you, again, for shelter, for safety." "For more than that, I hope," Hank said softly. "Much more," Emma agreed, her eyes conveying what words could not adequately express. The ride back to town was filled with light conversation and frequent stops to admire the landscape washed clean by the rain. They parted at the edge of Fort Worth, Hank reluctant to subject Emma to the gossip that would inevitably follow if they rode in together, she equally reluctant to say goodbye even for a day. "Tomorrow," he promised, touching his hat brim. "Tomorrow," she echoed, already counting the hours. True to his word, Hank appeared at the schoolhouse the following afternoon just as Emma was dismissing her students. He had brought flowers, a bunch of wild bluebonnets, an Indian paintbrush tied with a strip of leather, and a shy smile that made Emma's heart turn over in her chest. "Thought you might like some color for your desk," he said, presenting the bouquet with an awkward formality that touched her deeply. "They're beautiful," Emma replied, inhaling their sweet fragrance. "Thank you." From that day forward, Hank became a regular visitor at the schoolhouse and at Emma's cottage. He helped her establish a garden in the overgrown plot behind her home, built shelves for her growing collection of books, and even occasionally assisted with school maintenance, fixing a leaky roof and securing loose floorboards. The townspeople noticed, of course. There were whispers at first, raised eyebrows and knowing glances. But as the weeks passed and Hank's presence in town became commonplace rather than remarkable, the gossip gave way to acceptance. The reclusive rancher was courting the schoolteacher, an unexpected pairing, perhaps, but one that seemed to bring happiness to both parties. Emma found herself falling deeper in love with each passing day. She loved Hank's quiet strength, his understated intelligence, his deep connection to the land. She loved the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he handled children and animals, the respect he showed for her profession and her independence. For his part, Hank seemed to bloom under Emma's attention. He spoke more, laughed more, even began attending church services regularly, sitting beside her in the pew with an air of belonging that he had never felt before. "You've changed him," Mrs. Harrison observed one Sunday after service. "Never thought I'd see the day when Henry Forrester would voluntarily enter town 2 or 3 times a week, much less sit through Reverend Simmons' sermons without fidgeting." Emma smiled, watching as Hank conversed with the blacksmith across the churchyard. "I think we've changed each other," she said softly. By the time the school term ended in late spring, their courtship was common knowledge and generally approved. Emma had been offered a contract for the following year with a raise in salary. Her students had shown remarkable progress, and her little cottage had become a true home, with Hank's touches evident throughout, from the carved wooden hooks by the door to the rocking chair he had crafted to replace her rickety one. On the last day of school, after the children had presented her with a handmade card signed by them all and departed for the summer, Hank appeared as usual. But instead of flowers or a small trinket, this time he carried a nervous energy that made Emma's pulse quicken. "I thought we might ride up to the waterfall," he suggested, his voice pitched slightly higher than normal. "To celebrate the end of the term." Emma agreed readily, changing quickly from her teaching dress to a riding skirt she had sewn specifically for their frequent excursions. They rode in comfortable silence, though Emma could sense Hank's tension in the set of his shoulders, the way he frequently cleared his throat as if about to speak, then thought better of it. When they reached the waterfall, the spot was even more beautiful than Emma remembered, lush with late spring growth, the pool reflecting the clear blue sky above, wildflowers dotting the surrounding meadow with splashes of color. Hank helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. "There's something I want to show you," he said, taking her hand and leading her along a narrow path that skirted the pool. Beyond the waterfall, hidden from view unless one knew where to look, lay a small clearing ringed by pine trees. In the center stood a foundation of freshly cut logs and a frame that was clearly the beginning of a structure. "What is this?" Emma asked, puzzled. Hank took a deep breath. "It could be our home," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his eyes, "if you wanted it to be." Emma's hand flew to her mouth. "Our home," Hank nodded, taking both her hands in his. "Emma Ainsworth, I've loved you since the moment you grabbed my wrist on that cliff edge, maybe even before if that's possible. These past months have been the happiest of my life." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "I'm asking you to marry me, to build a life with me here where we can see the waterfall from our porch and still be close enough to town for your teaching." Tears filled Emma's eyes, spilling over to track down her cheeks. "You would do that?" "Move closer to town, give up your solitude." "For you, I would," Hank said simply. "For us. My ranch will still be there, we can keep the cattle, hire help to manage them, but I want to be where you are, Emma, where we can both have what matters to us." Emma pulled him to his feet, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, I'll marry you, Hank Forrester." Their kiss was a seal on the promise, deep and sweet and full of joy. When they finally broke apart, Hank's eyes were suspiciously bright. "I hoped you'd say that," he admitted. "Been planning this for weeks." Emma laughed, wiping away happy tears. "Is that why you've been sneaking off with Mr. Cooper and his sons? They've been helping you build?" Hank nodded. "Figured I'd need help to get it done before winter." "Wanted to surprise you." "You succeeded," Emma said, turning to survey what would be their home. "It's perfect, Hank, absolutely perfect." They spent the afternoon walking the property, Hank pointing out where each room would be, where they would plant a garden, where Emma could establish a small library for her books. The plans revealed how much thought he had put into creating a space that would suit them, both a blend of practicality and beauty, just like their relationship. As the sun began to set, they reluctantly mounted their horses for the ride back to town. "When?" Emma asked simply as they rode side by side. "Whenever you want," Hank replied. "Though I was thinking perhaps July, after the Independence Day celebrations. Give us time to prepare and for me to get the house further along." "July sounds perfect," Emma agreed. Not too long to wait, but enough time to make arrangements. They parted at the edge of town as usual, but this time Hank leaned across the space between their horses to kiss her soundly, heedless of who might see. "I love you, Emma Ainsworth," he said, his voice carrying in the still evening air. "Soon to be Emma Forrester." "I love you too," she replied, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain her happiness. "More than I can say." The news of their engagement spread through Fort Worth like wildfire. By the following morning, Emma had received a dozen visitors bearing congratulations and offers of help with wedding preparations. Mrs. Harrison immediately appointed herself unofficial wedding coordinator, while Mr. Whittaker offered the use of his garden for the ceremony. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of activity. Emma divided her time between helping Hank with the new house, sewing her wedding dress with Mrs. Harrison's assistance, and preparing for the fall term. Hank, for his part, worked tirelessly on their home, determined to have at least the main living areas completed before they married. On warm evenings, they would often ride to the building site, bringing a picnic supper to eat on what would be their front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. These were Emma's favorite moments, sitting side by side, sharing their hopes for the future, planning their life together. "We'll need a spare room," Hank mentioned one evening, seemingly casual, though Emma detected a note of significance in his voice. "For visitors or family?" Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. "Children, you mean?" she felt rather than saw his nod. "If you want them," he said carefully. "I know your teaching is important to you." "I do want them," Emma assured him. "And yes, teaching is my vocation, but I believe I can do both." "Many of my students' mothers manage it." Hank's arm tightened around her. "You'll be a wonderful mother," he said softly. "Patient and kind like you are with your pupils." "And you'll be a wonderful father," Emma replied, turning to kiss his cheek. "Steady and strong and gentle." The image of Hank holding their child, a little boy with his blue eyes, or a girl with his quiet determination, filled Emma with a longing so intense it nearly took her breath away. A family of their own, something neither of them had thought to find again after their losses. July 15th dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself approved of the union about to take place. Emma, dressed in the simple but elegant gown she had created, ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, her mother's pearl earrings her only adornment. Mrs. Harrison arranged her hair, weaving wildflowers into the braids she coiled at the nape of Emma's neck. "You look radiant," the older woman declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Hank Forrester won't know what hit him." The ceremony was held in the Whitacres' garden, beneath an arbor draped with roses and honeysuckle. Emma's students formed an honor guard along the path, scattering flower petals as she walked toward Hank, who waited for her with an expression of such naked adoration that tears sprang to her eyes. He was handsome in a new suit of dark blue, his hair neatly trimmed, his face clean shaven for the occasion. But it was the love in his eyes that transformed him, that made every woman present sigh with appreciation and every man nod in understanding. This was a man utterly captivated by his bride, and unashamed to show it. The Reverend Simmons kept the ceremony brief, seeming to understand that the couple before him needed no lengthy sermon on the duties of matrimony. They had found in each other a partnership that transcended conventional roles, a bond forged in the dramatic circumstances of their meeting and tempered by the genuine friendship that had grown between them. When Hank slid the simple gold band onto Emma's finger and spoke his vows in a voice steady with conviction, there wasn't a dry eye in the gathering. And when Emma, in turn, placed a matching ring on his hand, a surprise she had arranged with the help of the blacksmith, his expression of wonder and gratitude nearly undid her completely. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Hank didn't wait for permission to kiss his bride. He gathered Emma into his arms with gentle reverence, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a promise of all that was to come. The celebration afterward was joyous music and dancing in the town square, a feast contributed to by nearly every household in Fort Worth. Toasts and well wishes from friends and neighbors who had come to care deeply for the schoolteacher and her once reclusive rancher. As the sun began to set, Hank drew Emma aside. "Ready to see our home?" he asked softly. "It's not completely finished, but enough for tonight." Emma nodded, too full of happiness for words. They slipped away amid cheers and good-natured teasing, mounting the horses that had been prepared for them, adorned with ribbons and flowers by Emma's students. The ride to their new home was magical, the golden light of late afternoon giving way to the soft purple of dusk, fireflies beginning to dance among the trees, the air sweet with summer blossoms. When they crested the final rise and the house came into view, Emma gasped in delight. Hank had worked miracles in the weeks since he had first shown her the foundation. The main structure was complete, a cozy cabin larger than his original home but still modest, with a broad porch facing the waterfall just as he had promised. Light glowed from the windows and smoke curled from the stone chimney. "Someone's there?" Emma asked in surprise. Hank smiled. Mrs. Cooper came up earlier to prepare things for us. She should be gone by now, but she wanted to make sure there was a fire lit and food waiting. Indeed, when they entered their new home, they found a table set for two with a cold supper, a fire crackling in the hearth and fresh wildflowers in a jar on the mantel. A note propped against the flowers read simply, "Welcome home, Mr. and Mrs. Forrester. God bless your union." Emma turned slowly, taking in the main room with its simple but beautiful furnishings, much of it handcrafted by Hank himself. She realized, recognizing his distinctive style in the table, chairs, and mantelpiece. Doorways led off to what would be their bedroom and a smaller room that could serve as a study or nursery. "Do you like it?" Hank asked, a hint of anxiety in his voice. "There's still work to be done. The spare room isn't finished, and I want to add a proper kitchen next summer," but Emma silenced him with a kiss. "It's perfect," she said against his lips. "Absolutely perfect. Our home, Hank, ours." Later, much later, they stood together on the porch, wrapped in a quilt against the night's chill, listening to the distant sound of the waterfall and gazing up at stars that seemed close enough to touch. Emma leaned back against Hank's chest, his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her head. "Happy?" he asked softly. "More than I ever thought possible," Emma replied truthfully. She turned in his arms to face him. "Do you ever think about that night? On the cliff?" Hank nodded, his expression solemn. "Every day, how close I came to never knowing you, never having this." His arms tightened around her. "Providence, you called it then, and I still believe it," Emma said, "that we were meant to find each other even in such unlikely circumstances." Hank brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "I never thought I'd love again," he admitted. "Thought that part of me died in the war along with so much else." "And now?" Emma asked, though she knew the answer in the way he held her, the way he looked at her. "Now I can't imagine not loving you," Hank said simply. "You brought me back to life, Emma Forrester." Pulled me back from my own kind of cliff edge. Emma rose on tiptoe to kiss him, pouring all her love, all her gratitude, all her joy into the connection. "And you caught me when I fell," she whispered against his lips. "In every way that matters." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other and in the night's tranquility. Two souls who had found in each other the healing, the home, the hope they had both been seeking without knowing it. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and below, the waterfall continued its eternal song constants in a world of change, like the love that had blossomed between them against all odds in the wild heart of Texas. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the meadow as Emma watched from the porch, a sleeping infant cradled in her arms. Her husband moved through the tall grass, their 3-year-old son perched on his shoulders, both of them intent on capturing the butterfly that fluttered just beyond reach. "Careful, Joshua," she called as the boy leaned precariously forward. "Hold on to Papa's hair." Hank glanced back at her, his smile as warm and sure as the summer sun overhead. "We've got this, don't we, pardner?" he said to the child, who nodded enthusiastically and grabbed fistfuls of his father's dark hair. Emma shook her head, smiling at their antics. In the 5 years since their wedding, Hank had proven himself to be an exceptional father, patient, loving, endlessly willing to enter into childish games and explorations. He had taken to parenthood with the same quiet determination he brought to everything he valued, building a family with the same careful attention he had given to building their home. The house had expanded along with their family, the promised kitchen addition, a larger bedroom for the children, even a small schoolroom where Emma taught during the winter months when the journey to town became difficult. In summer, she still made the trip 3 days a week, sharing teaching duties with a young woman who had been one of her first pupils. The ranch had prospered as well. With hired help to manage the daily operations of the cattle business, Hank was able to divide his time between the original property and their home by the waterfall. Their life had found a rhythm that accommodated both his love of the land and her dedication to education. The infant in Emma's arms stirred, tiny fists waving as blue eyes her father's eyes blinked open. "Hello, sweet girl," Emma murmured, adjusting the blanket around her daughter's face. "Did your brother wake you with all his excitement?" At 2 months old, little Sarah was a peaceful baby, content to sleep in her mother's arms or in the cradle Hank had carved for her, watching the world with solemn interest. Joshua had been more demanding as an infant, always eager to be in motion, to see and touch and explore. The differences in their personalities were already evident, a source of constant fascination to their parents. Hank approached the porch, Joshua still on his shoulders but now clutching something in his small hands. "Show Mama what we caught," he encouraged, lifting the boy down to the steps. Joshua ran to Emma, opening his cupped hands carefully to reveal a tiny green frog. "Look, Mama, he's for Sarah when she gets bigger." Emma laughed, leaning forward so her son could see the baby's face. "That's very thoughtful of you, Joshua, but I think Sarah is still too little for pets. Why don't you and Papa find a nice home for the frog down by the creek?" Joshua considered this, his expression serious beneath the shock of dark hair that was so like his father's. "Okay," he agreed finally, "but I'll catch her another one when she's bigger." "I'm sure you will," Emma said, exchanging an amused glance with Hank over the boy's head. As father and son set off toward the creek, Emma settled back in her rocking chair, a contentment so deep it was almost painful filling her chest. How far they had come from that stormy night on the cliff edge. From strangers thrust together by circumstance to this a family, a home, a love that had only grown stronger with each passing year. There had been challenges, of course. The difficult birth of Joshua, which had left Emma bedridden for weeks. The drought that had threatened their cattle 2 summers ago. The fire that had damaged part of the schoolhouse last winter. But through it all, they had faced each obstacle together, their partnership a steady foundation that could weather any storm. Hank returned alone, having settled Joshua with his wooden blocks on a blanket near the creek, within sight of the porch but far enough away to give them a moment of privacy. "How are my girls?" he asked, settling beside Emma on the wide bench he had built when she was expecting Joshua and couldn't get comfortable in a regular chair. "Contemplative," Emma replied with a smile, shifting the baby so Hank could see her face. "I think she's trying to decide if the world is to her liking." Hank traced a gentle finger over Sarah's petal-soft cheek. "With you for her mother, how could it not be?" he said softly. After 5 years of marriage, he could still make her blush with such comments. Emma leaned into his side, savoring the solid warmth of him. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" "You have," Hank replied, pressing a kiss to her temple, "but I never tire of hearing it." "I love you, Henry Forrester," Emma said, lifting her face for a proper kiss. "More with each passing day." Hank obliged, his lips tender against hers. "And I love you, Emma Forrester, for saving me from myself, for giving me this family, for making each day better than the last." A shout from Joshua drew their attention. He had spotted a rabbit at the edge of the trees and was pointing excitedly. Hank smiled. "Duty calls," he said, rising to join their son in his discoveries. Emma watched him go, this man who had caught her when she fell, literally and figuratively. Who had built a home for her, given her children, supported her teaching, and loved her with a steadfast devotion that still took her breath away. Who had emerged from his self-imposed isolation to become the center of a family, the heart of a community, the love of her life. As if sensing her thoughts, Hank glanced back, his smile conveying all that words could not. Emma returned it, cradling their daughter closer. From the brink of disaster on a rain-slick cliff, to this moment of perfect contentment, their journey had been unexpected. Sometimes difficult, but ultimately more rewarding than either could have imagined on that stormy night when fate had thrown them together. "Grab my wrist and do not look down," he had told her then. And she had trusted him, had placed her life in his hands without hesitation. In return, he had trusted her with his heart, his solitude, his carefully guarded peace. Together, They had built something neither had thought to find again after their respective losses: a family, a future, a love that would see them through whatever joys and sorrows lay ahead. As the sun began its descent behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Emma whispered a prayer of gratitude for the storm that had nearly claimed her life, but had instead led her to her greatest happiness. For the cowboy who had appeared like a guardian angel on that treacherous path. For the life they had created together, one day, one moment, one act of love at a time. In the meadow, Joshua's laughter rang out as Hank swung him in a wide circle, their joy a tangible thing that seemed to shimmer in the evening light. Sarah stirred against Emma's breast, her tiny mouth forming what might have been her first smile. This was their legacy, Emma thought. Not just the ranch, not just the school, but this love they had cultivated and nurtured that would live on in their children and in the memories of all whose lives they touched. A love born in danger, tempered by time and destined to endure long after they were gone. A love that had begun with a simple command: grab my wrist and do not look down, and had become the foundation upon which they had built everything that mattered.